Oh, well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And to Mark, I thought it was fantastic. That it's great to finally see what you do, because we've been in many rooms together. It's like show and tell. So, so it's a great topic to share. I'm just going to bring that down a bit. To share and think about, because it's something that I don't have a fixed answer to, and I'm constantly inquiring about. But I've been asked to just sort of reflect on how research in practice has come about from my perspective. And I was very lucky that I set up a practice and didn't want to work for the big boys, and went in for some competitions that the Labour government at the time were doing in education, and very rapidly had the opportunity to explore form in a way that I thought the kitchen extension was going to be my kind of oeuvre, but in fact got to build buildings which did extraordinary things, like had huge cantilevers for nursery schools, made out of materials at the time. This is before the Laban Centre by Herzog de Meuron, using polycarbonate, making spaces that responded to their users' needs, and finding that the client came back and asked for more. So this is in Dagenham, 2 nurseries and a children's centre. Then going on to win an RIBA competition for a Sure Start centre in Colchester, where we said, oh, it should have an arresting form. And you can see it from above because of the topography. And wouldn't it be great if the surface on the walls, now remember this is about 15 years ago, the surface on the wall went up and went onto the roof, and we made it all out of timber. So this was a first. We actually got our client to allow us to make a timber roof. This is old run-of-the-mill, but involved a huge amount of speculation because nobody was doing it at the time. Dagenham came back for more, asked us to do a primary school where we were interested in making a kind of micro-urban environment at William Bellamy School and responding to the history of Dagenham with its industrial background. But very much after talking to the children about what they liked on their walk to school, discovered that we could make spaces that responded to their scale of inquiry. They liked the worms and the sort of foxes and the kind of the occasional rat scurrying across the street from the nearby waste depot. But we could make this kind of interior world in an industrial setting that would be well and truly loved. And we loved the fact too that we liked photos by Ellen Binet, but we actually preferred this at the end of the day. So on that success, very fortunate to get on a short list to design a new building at a Cambridge college at Churchill, and really pushed our endeavours to create this rather sort of Kubrick-like building, the Collaborative Learning Centre at the Muller Centre, where we looked at using sort of reflectivity as a materiality, and again, these rather strange forms that we were producing, and these kind of look no hands corners that were engaging you with nature. After education, as a kind of main body that we were interested in, other people like developers came knocking at our doors. One guy said from More London, "Would you like to design a building? I'll give you this project for a cafe by the park at More London." And we couldn't believe it. We thought he might be expecting to get a Foster-esque pavilion, given its context and our work to date. But we discovered a unique history to the site. On my first site visit, I met Roy, and he told me that he used to play on that site as a child on the bomb sites. And I thought he was winding me up, but when we got back, it's the kind of stream that we follow. We found out Roy was right, and he wasn't lying. Bombs had indeed dropped on Potter's Field, and I felt very much, and so did the team, that how come you never felt that when you were in More London? So we thought, how could we embed a bit of burning into our architecture? And again, this was the first burnt timber building, which is now quite a commonly available material. We didn't know when we did this research, worked with Trada to set up a specification to burn larch, because it had never been done before, that in fact you could get it off the internet in Japan anyway. So that was one of those interesting bits of inquiry. But we also developed urban mapping while we were on that project. How could we map the toings and goings of existing, that's the circular white spaces at the mayor's office by the river, how you could predict where people are moving at the moment and where they'll move in the future, and combine that with their views so that our building allowed views through and into the privately owned public spaces of More London and didn't sort of block access to an important bit of London's kind of riverside. But one of our biggest coups was in 2004, when we were only about 6 people. We saw an advert for Surrey County Council to join one of their frameworks to make education architecture. And we just persisted and persisted on the back of those nurseries to go through a hugely extended procurement process to get onto their framework. With final success. We were the only small practice that got on. The others were sort of very much larger practices. And they said, we've got some really bad news for you, I'm afraid. You're a small practice, and your fees are really too high. So we can't offer you our general kind of education project. Unfortunately, you'll only be allowed to tender for the really big projects, because that's where you showed value for money. And what was amazing is literally about 3 months later, Surrey called up and said, we've got a fantastic campus of 2 new schools in Guildford. We're just going to have an interview because you're all on the framework. And we romped home and brought home an extremely large project, which was really about punching above our weight at that point. So we built Christ College Secondary School and Pond Meadow Special Needs School at one time simultaneously, with a contract value of over £25 million. Our previous biggest project had been about 3, and that got onto the Sterling shortlist, which for us in 2010 was an extraordinary feat. We really enjoyed sort of pushing a very sort of confident language of spaces. This was originally, when we left the project, this was a library. We were delighted to go back to discover that the school were using it for sports. We pushed the technology of brickwork. So here you have a concealed heat and ventilation system in kind of dovecot brickwork beneath the windowsills, using the skills that I'd grown up with of laying bricks with my grandfather and my uncle, and really pushing with one-to-one templates the way that we could get bricklayers to rediscover their skills. The contractor was horrified when we rolled out these laminated sheets for them to work with, quite one-to-one in a way that you were describing, Mark. But the bricklayers were absolutely delighted because they could finally get to do something other than standard brickwork. So this was Pond Meadow, where it was a more standardised kind of production because it was a steel building rather than a masonry building, but had wonderful spaces within. But we were determined that something like a special school should be arresting, it should be part of the community, and it should really contribute. So we made bricks fly. These are flying cantilevered precast panels with kind of light dropping through the canopy. So it was during that period that the recession hit in sort of 2008. And that was that kind of confluence of procurement, politics, economics. And I've been asked to say, what did I learn from that experience? Well, we still had that big project going for a good year or so we weren't immediately hit. But what did happen in 2010 is another Melbourne institution, RMIT, came knocking at my door and asked if I wanted to do one of their first European practice-based PhDs. And I was slightly reluctant. It seemed like a lot of navel-gazing to spend time looking at what you do and why you do it. So I took up the challenge. My company allowed me to do this. It didn't mean going to Australia, unfortunately, for 3 years. It meant just meeting once every 6 months in a European capital, either in a European country in Ghent or later in Barcelona, to come together at these graduate research conferences where we would all sort of discuss how we were taking apart and unpacking our practices, looking at what we did, how we did it, and then questioning why. So out of it came Orbits and Trajectories, Why Architecture Must Never Stand Still. And it really was a very simple process after the fact. So we were asked to pull together a series of our projects and to look at them, and different people have different methodologies. I followed quite a sort of a simple, proven methodology that was promoted by Leon van Schaik. So I looked at and made a catalogue of all of those projects that I would be looking at, and then began to start trying to work out how I would break down my analysis. And I discovered that I'm dyslexic, so writing is an absolute nightmare for me. But what I did discover was I love diagrams. So in fact, most of my PhD was unfolded, concertinaed kind of analysis. And so we looked at the evidence of the kind of themes that was available in the work that we made. And to do that, kind of looked at projects and found out what people had wrote about them. So we went to a third party to kind of analyse our work, reviews, critiques, etc. And from that we came out with a certain number of themes, and we chose I chose 5 themes that went through the work that people were talking about. So there was a fact that quite often people considered our work to be deeply social. We were likened to the Smithsons at one point, which was very flattering, if a bit unnerving. We always had something to do with gardens, verandas, and kind of outdoor space. Environmental performance and the sense of personal comfort was very important. And then this one word came up, awkward, which was, why did we make bricks fly, for example? And why did we set fire to our own buildings? Why would we, like the columns that you can see there, make very large concrete structures to a scale that hadn't been made before? And in addition to those 2 categories, I did some analysis, which I can just show here. I made these kind of kite diagrams where I'd look and reflect on these projects from my own point of view and that of others to see whether they'd been successful or not. And I also put into the mix, just shown here on the right, whether they'd actually received awards and whether they'd had recognition in terms of media appeal. And what we discovered was quite a lot of our buildings, you might think they've won awards, because we have won quite a few awards, we're quite lucky, but actually it's the most appealing ones, the ones that get the biggest sort of downloads when you put them on the internet, actually don't win awards. And what we discovered was perhaps when things are a bit too fresh and a bit too new, people kind of slightly do a double take and sort of think, oh, I don't really feel comfortable with that, that's not familiar. And it's quite often our buildings get called ugly to begin with. So this really intrigued me. So looking at materiality, I'll come back to that ugly question. Materiality, people were commenting that, you know, we take the familiar and we do unconventional things with them, and that's a kind of unnerving quality even at a material condition. So I thought that's quite interesting. People have talked about this civic condition in our architecture, and from that has alighted onto this sort of thing that's really changed my practice through doing the PhD, is the use of the B word, which is beauty, which rather like going out and buying a really amazing pair of trainers when you're in your teens and all of your parents' friends are just like, oh my God, why are you wearing those trainers? They are disgusting. Yet you see them in 5 or 10 years' time wearing said trainers. You know, this unfamiliarity is something that we have to kind of embrace. We are trying to make architecture that does do something extra. So Leon van Schaik asked me to look at this early John Perry project, and he said, do you know the work of Ed Ruscha, the artist? And I said, yeah, I do. He said, well, have you never considered that there might be something similar going on, that Ed would take things that were sort of familiar and then really recast them so that you could ask what they were? And I did more research into Ed Ruscha, and I came up with this artwork that he made, which is, you see this badly done on purpose, but this badly done on purpose thing was done so well that it just becomes, let's say, profound. And by that, I mean that when we make buildings that arrest you, they're not iconic, they just make you do a little bit of a double take. We're quite conscious of the fact that we're trying to make the public engage with their environment. In the digital age, where people are on screens, persistently distracted, and really not touching the ground anymore, architecture can have a very significant role in connecting people with the environment and all of the consequences with that. What I did discover as well, and I had never recognised really until the PhD, was that there were 2 sides to DSDHA, and they were actually the same all the way through our practice. Rather than doing teaching as a way of earning money, which really wasn't the case, it was more we can look at bigger issues than our practice doing its bathroom or loft conversions could allow. We'd always looked at this urban scale of work. So for example, we looked at Mayfair one year, discovered that it hadn't changed in 300 years and discovered that's probably why people liked it. Noticed that mapping, students going round in 2 kinds of dress, getting a different social reaction in different locations in Mayfair, whether they were dressed as a chav, that's her terms, not mine, versus the kind of social acceptance of conformity. And coming out of that, you know, really wonderful projects that they produced into sort of embassies for countries, for example, without any embassy representation. Or another project just 2 years ago where we looked at the scale of between infrastructure and intimacy, which has been a theme throughout our work. We looked at HS2 and we said, we love HS2, we love infrastructure, how can we make it beautiful? And that work developed some really useful propositions about when we have infrastructure, can we bring a new use to it? And it got quite broadly published as a result afterwards. So consequent to this, I've been aware that the work has now merged between research in a much more conscious way. So our urban research base now comprises work that we've done, for example, the Fellowship for the Built Environment from the Royal Commission of 1851. I put this up here. It comes out every 2 years. Apply. It's an open call for architects and designers to contribute to questions of the day. The year that I applied was a question of what to do with the Albertopolis after Exhibition Road. Surprisingly, a great coincidence happened because about 4 years before I had had some students from Switzerland look at the relationship between Hyde Park and the kind of uses it had at night and the Crystal Palace. We'd discovered amazing artifacts about how the Crystal Palace was mapped within the palm of your hand in this wonderful glove map of London. We went back to the site and looked at how people were very lost at the moment, but felt terrifically found when they stood outside the Royal Albert Hall, and took these iconic images both to and from the hall to the memorial, and how the current road conditions were just completely inhibiting people, and the lack of level crossings were making it incredibly unsafe. This is what happens when an event finishes at Hyde Park outside the memorial. You get thousands of people stumbling across the road. So InTrain now, out of that research, is a live project to look at the wholesale redevelopment of that connection between those icons. So we really do see now in our work a consciousness between design action and design values through the PhD. So projects that have been consequent, or this was actually done at the time of the PhD, the Alex Munro studio in Snowsfield, we had a consciousness about the materiality, a real desire to work with the people who were going to make it and find out how they were making it and build on those skills. And get right down to the detail, as well as making kind of workspace that worked on all those levels we talked about before. And what's happened too is our projects have got bigger. Just a final project to just whiz through is, wanting to expand between intimacy and infrastructure, getting a call one day saying, would you like to be on a shortlist to redesign Tottenham Court Road? Saying, of course we would, but we've never done anything like that before. The guys from Camden saying, we think you've got what it takes. Can you zoom in, I don't know if you can quite see the red line, on this significant part of London right next to the new Crossrail station and the British Museum? Can you cope with a design that's about 3 kilometres long, going all the way from Cambridge Circus up to Warren Street? Can you redesign this setting and the consequences of Crossrail to make a city where the people really do choose to go? We won this because we showed this image, which is Primark had just opened on the eastern end of Tottenham Court Road, and we had noticed that people were suddenly surging to this bit of city. They really liked the way that we connected the real life, people's day-to-day lives, with the prospect of change in the city. And also, it was a moment when we recognised the kind of personal risks you take in architecture. In order to get the photographs that we needed for the interview, it involved that, standing in the face of 4 lanes of oncoming traffic, to get images that would complement our work, at the same time as taking personal risks, absolutely carrying on talking to people to discover why and how they use this part of town, so that we could take this congested centre and turn it into this. It's a project that's going on site and should be finished in 2018. And finally, you can see the icon of the wonderful centre point as approaching from the north rather than always travelling in the opposite direction, taking really unused streets and making them into the West End's first park in 100 years. This is Alfred Place, just near the building centre. Linking areas like Prince's Circus, where we're closing Shaftesbury Avenue and creating a new public space, I don't know if it's moving, that operates during the day and lets people walk from Covent Garden to the British Museum without taking the tube, because it's only a 5-minute walk, and then crucially enables them to enjoy the West End at night. So finally, part of what you said was the real core ambition that I discovered I had, that I would never have discovered if it weren't for the PhD, was that I have an absolute passion for democratizing access to architecture. Said grandfather and said uncle probably would have been architects had they been able to economically. That's why I've been spending a huge amount of time setting up from scratch with Will Hunter and a team of us the new LSA. We've been going for 1 year. We've got a full active programme. We've been passed by our external examiners. We're going into our 2nd year. We're producing amazing work like no other school, which is great to see. And we've just got this fantastic trailblazing, risk-taking bunch of new architects who are going to change the future. And rather like Mark's image of the kind of phasing of kind of designing a way of working together, we actually still do use the blackboard in my studio to kind of plan and plot ahead. And we're deploying what we call design thinking. It's the buzzword of the day. To really see if you can design a future for architecture. Thanks.